Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Squared Up Coffee Break webinar on the Web API tile and integration with ServiceNow. My name is Matthew Long, and I'm joined today by one of our engineering team, Sam Lord.
Hello.
Sam has worked incredibly hard on the Web API tile since its kind of inception, and also done a lot of the work on 3.2 as well. So I'm very excited to have him on today to show off some of the fruits of his labour and what we've been getting up to here at Squared Up. So the focus on today is going to be the Web API integration. So using our Web API tile to integrate with external data sources. So similar to how we do with OMS and SQL, bringing data that sits outside of SCOM into SCOM and showing it in the same context. So we can now start achieving these sort of single pane of glass ambitions that we've had for quite a while. We're going to do that specifically sort of with ServiceNow as a worked example. So if you're not using ServiceNow, but you're interested in using Web API to integrate with other ITSM products or other monitoring products, this will still be of value because you're going to see how that's configured, how it's used. If you are really into ServiceNow, then great, you're going to actually see some really good worked examples here of what we're actually looking at and how to get this all up and running. So we'll look at the Web API capabilities. Some recent changes here with 3.2 have drastically changed how this works, so we'll definitely take a look at that. Then we'll look at configuring providers, which is how we actually connect Squared Up to our external sources. And then finally, we'll actually look at integrating with ServiceNow and running some queries. So if you've been seeing on our demos previously, those Squared Up, those ServiceNow dashboards and perspectives and wondering how we did it, now you're actually going to finally get to see how we created those. So this should be pretty good for everyone. Okay, so just to get started, Web API integration, as I said, lets us integrate data from external sources into that single pane of glass alongside SCOM. And this slide's very similar to sort of OMS and other things we've done in this area. So it queries the live API data and puts that directly on your dashboard or perspective. There's no need to set up users in external systems to share this out. So if someone can get access to Squared Up, they can now see that data in context. So it's great for sharing enterprise-wide out rather than having to give everyone another tool they have to learn and provision more permissions and manage more credentials. And because the results are displayed on demand, that is, we query that API when someone actually views the dashboard, there's no extra storage. So we're not going to fill SCOM up with all the data inside ServiceNow. We're going to leave that in ServiceNow and then just pull it in as and when we actually need it. So it's a very, very powerful technique that really scales as well. So hopefully that's got you all sort of thinking about some of the possibilities you can use this for. The Web API tile specifically lets you display data from any JSON-based API inside Squared Up. Now, the key point here is that the queries are made from the Squared Up server using stored credentials. So the Squared Up server itself actually is communicating that request and talking to the Web API, and that sort of request is sent when you load the dashboard. So it's centralized. Okay, that's a really sort of important concept to bear in mind because, as Sam's going to show us later on, that can come into play when we start looking at servers that are inside sort of security hardened environments. Now, we also support a couple of different authentication methods. So Sam, can you walk us through what we support?
Yeah, so we support basic authentication, Windows authentication, and OAuth version 2.
Okay.
Specifically, we don't support OAuth version 1.0a. Windows authentication will be configured automatically. Basic auth just requires setting up a header, and OAuth 2 is a little bit more involved and uses grant types, which we'll be covering
sort of in a future slide. Yeah. So the key thing there, like basic and OAuth, those are external standards, aren't they? Right. So like they're not custom to Squared Up. So you could presumably go and get that documentation from sort of anyone how to do this. And Basic and OAuth are quite popular with sort of cloud-based providers, aren't they?
Yeah. So Basic auth in particular, you can just look up a guide online on how to make the header for that. And OAuth 2, you'll want to be looking at the documentation for the specific API that you'll be using. Okay,
cool. So the other thing that's quite important is that we actually have some caching in place as well, don't we? So sort of try and make this scale properly.
Yeah, indeed. That's very short scale caching just to make sure that if you have, say, multiple tiles which are querying the exact same thing and just displaying it differently, they will use exactly the same data, just retrieving it from Squared Up and not and just querying the external service once.
So what about if you've got like 10 users all looking at the same dashboard, same thing?
Yep, that's exactly the same there.
Cool, excellent. So that's quite helpful in sort of where you've got APIs that are rate limited and things as well, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, excellent. Now we do support scalar and table display, which is the ability to have it as a grid or display the data as a single sort of value, and that's the same as our SQL tiles and also with a few others like data on demand. And in 3.2, Sam has been very busy on a whole ton of improvements, which I'm quite excited to show here. So if you've ever had a support ticket with Squared Up, and myself or Sam has answered that ticket and said, oh, that will be supported in a future release, well, congratulations, that day has now come.
Yep.
So can you walk us through some of these, Sam?
Yeah, so the JSON and XML plaintext bodies, so that lets us integrate with loads of different external APIs. So where previously we could only use form post bodies, so that was sort of key value pairs. This allows for more free-form data, and specifically if you've been waiting for that, you'll know about it. And then the ignore SSL, that's a really important one for targeting internal services where there's potentially self-signed certificates. This isn't really for cloud-based things. This is just internal only when you've got self-signed certificates which aren't trusted by your Squared Up server. They'll now be able to just ignore those errors and proceed with any requests.
And the big item there is that's required for Splunk support, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, cool. So that's in now. So now we can finally actually integrate with Splunk as well. And then the sort of other big item really is the new grid designer, which for those of you who are on the 3.2 release webinar that we ran last week, or the week before, we sort of showed that off, but we're going to go into real depth here. So the grid designer now lets you customize like the columns that are displayed and lets you do things like set up the rows to hyperlink automatically, so you can click on one and jump out to your external data source. So classic example there is I'm showing a list of incidents. I click on one of them and it takes me to my incident management tool and shows me that incident. So that's some really exciting stuff. Now I'm not going to, rather than spending even more time on this slide, let's actually go and do a demo of some of this stuff here. So Sam's going to walk us through just a very simple demo, which is just configuring the web API tile just to talk out to a public API just to grab a value and bring it back. So it's really simple, really sort of easy use cases to kind of get us going with this. So I'm just going to pass over control now to Sam.
Yep, so I'm just going to create a new dashboard and let's create a web API tile. This is going to be a scalar tile because we're just going to be retrieving one small piece of data from an external service.
Okay.
It's going to be the generic provider. We'll cover providers in much more detail in a minute, but for now this is just the default provider, which is just no default settings, really basic. And what we're going to be querying is IPify, which is just a really simple cloud service which lets us retrieve our IP address.
So the example that we're showing here on the docs for this is like a curl command. So typically when you go to the documentation for your API, they'll often show that as like a PowerShell command or a curl command you can run to kind of get started and test it. So we're just going to grab that URL and drop it into the tile here, right?
Yep. So we're just going to drop it straight in there.
Okay, cool.
So you can see there's a HTTP method here. We have a choice of get and post. This is just a really simple request. It's going to be a get request. Now what that means is that in this headers and data section, this data, if we add anything here, that will be rendered as URL parameters against the service. If we were to select post here, then as some of you may have seen before, the data here will be sent in the request body, and that means that it's just a different way of sending it, which some APIs will require.
Right, so like with like get, basically you're just making a simple query. With post, you're sort of sending a bunch of data as well that could be like, oh, here's the object I want information on, or here's the format I wanted on, that kind of thing.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
But what's more is that in 3.2, as we mentioned earlier, we can now send JSON as well, and XML and text.
So really can integrate with pretty much any sort of type they want.
Yep, that's the idea. But this is just a simple GET request, so we can skip over all of that. In the response data, I'm going to type in IP.
Okay.
And the reason for that is we don't want this this full top-level object. What we want is the data stored under the IP property.
Right, so the example there is that's the data that comes back when you query the API, and we're here saying we want the IP field on that object.
Yep, so we want exactly this string, which is stored at this property. And as you can see, that's returned an IP address. And this just reiterates the point that the IP address returned here, which is the IP address from my browser, is not the same IP address as the one returned here, because this is returned from the Squared Up server's query.
Right.
So this is the public IP address of the Squared Up server,
not the public IP address of your client. And I guess that's important for troubleshooting, right? Because if you're running a query that works like when you run the curl command or the PowerShell command, but then doesn't work when you put it in Squared Up, there could be a proxy in the way or a network gateway issue or something like that.
Yep, exactly.
Right, okay.
For a more secure environment, this might not work because they don't have access to this service in particular or just to any external web service.
Mm-hmm.
So best just to check with something simple before we go into anything more in-depth.
Excellent. Okay, cool. So that's just a very simple example. Obviously, it's not massively practical per se. We're just putting an IP address on the screen. But you can see now how you can do a query against a simple API that's maybe not got any authentication at endpoints. Now, that is a sort of a simple example. I'm just going to grab control back here, Sam, for a second. We looked at sort of a simple example, but let's actually make this a bit more real world. So we mentioned sort of providers earlier. What can you tell us about providers?
So there are two different types of providers.
Mm-hmm.
There are simple providers. These are, as you can see on the screen, unsecured, basic, or Windows authentication.
Mm-hmm.
And there are OAuth providers, which use the more complicated but possibly more secure OAuth.
So the idea of the provider essentially is it's used for sort of storing credentials and connection settings. And then this can be reused amongst lots of different tiles. So like a Squared Up admin can configure a provider and say, this is how we connect to this. This is an endpoint. This is how we connect to it. These are the credentials for it. And then other like dashboard authors can then leverage that to create queries against the API without necessarily having the keys to the kingdom and knowing all the details or having to keep inputting like URLs and things over and over again.
Yep, so the administrator will be entering in all of the credentials and the users don't have to see any of that. All they have to enter in is their single query and they get back their results.
Right,
nice
and
easy.
Presumably they're not, the user also isn't a Squared Up admin, they can't even go and see those credentials, they can't manage that at all, so it's kind of secure
exactly
as well.
Right.
Now, we're taking credentials here, so obviously let's just step aside for security a second. How are those stored in Squared Up? Like, are these secured credentials or?
Yep, so they're all stored in an encrypted file on the Squared Up server, and they are not shown to anyone without the edit web API settings role.
Okay, right. So that's definitely an admin permission sort of.
Yep.
There's no really other reason to give that out. Okay, cool. So that's a sort of a provider. What we're saying, like, let's create a provider now. Now you have the kind of context of what we're actually creating. Let's jump back into a demo and actually and take a look at these. So we're going to do two demos here. I'll do the first one, which is configuring a very simple provider for sort of an in-house Windows authenticated app. So in this case, it's System Center Orchestrator. You've all got SCOM, so likely if you're looking at this call, you've also got Orchestrator or you've heard about Orchestrator and you're aware that basically Microsoft provided a web API with that supports OData, so it's a JSON REST-based API. And because it uses Windows Auth, it's really easy with the provider just to throw the URL and connect to that. So I'll give you a very quick demo of just doing that. And then I'll flip back over and Sam's going to show us how to configure and connect to ServiceNow, permissions you'll need to do that, and kind of a demo of using OAuth 2, which is a little bit more complicated than just basic or Windows Auth. So hopefully that'll give you a real flavor of what's involved in getting all this working. Okay, so let me bring up Squared Up now. So I'm going to go and create a provider. So providers, as we mentioned, are an admin level item. So under the settings, there we go, settings menu here, there's a web API perspective. And there'll be a list of providers showing up here. So right now we have a generic sort of simple one. That's the one you used for your single example, right, Sam? Sort of you were showing off. And then we've got also a ServiceNow one here that's currently not quite working properly. Let's add a new provider by clicking the Add New button. I need to give it a name, so something descriptive like Orchestrator. And then it'll ask me, because this is a simple provider, it's asking me for the base URL. So this basically means whenever you want to try and connect, what's the sort of start of your web address so that you don't have to keep retyping that over and over and over again. Now, in the case of Orchestrator, that's going to be my Orchestrator server name, then coupled with a particular string, which is, again, defined in the Orchestrator docs. So when you install Orchestrator, it'll ask you, where do you want me to host this particular site? So it's actually on port 81 by default under the Orchestrator 2012/Orchestrator SVC page. And you can just browse that in your browser and you'll actually see that showing up. Now, because this is a Windows authenticated endpoint, like see I'm not adding any permissions here, Squared Up will automatically try and pass through the Squared Up website's application pool ID for Windows authenticated apps. What that means is that the Squared Up application pool has to have rights to talk to, in this case, Orchestrator. So in Orchestrator, I've gone and added the computer account for Squared Up Demo Pro 01 in this case, and given it the permissions it needs. I've only granted it read access because it doesn't need to be able to modify anything, so there's no need there to make changes. So make sure you secure your APIs when you do this as well. Don't give the dashboard account more permissions than it needs, because it is going to be allowed to run any arbitrary query. Squared Up isn't going to vet that this is only a read-only query. It's just going to run whatever you give it or whatever users are authorized to give it. So make sure it's permissioned properly. And all I have to do now is hit add provider, which is really, really simple. So I'll go ahead and add that now. There we go. And you can see I've got the base URL there. And now if you've done this before, another thing I want to highlight in 3.2, you can actually edit these now. So you'll see there's a little gear. I can come over here and make changes to this. So if you've ever been tinkering away with this before and you've been, like I have, recreating these over and over and over again, we've now got an API for updating these things, which is brilliant. Okay, that's the provider created. Let's just go and create a very, very quick dashboard just to make sure it works. So web API, I want to do a grid one in this case. I just want to show that I can display all the runbooks. So let's wait for that to load. Orchestrator. And you see it's already put the base URL in for me, so that makes it really easy to keep creating lots and lots of tiles that use this. I'm just going to put in runbooks, so it's going to show me all the runbooks in the system. And now what it's done at the bottom, I'll go through the headers and data and the response data. So it's giving me D and then object. And what that means is that the response data that came back had a field called D in it with further JavaScript objects inside of it, or JSON objects. So I want to display those, so I put D in here. That'll then do the same thing for results, which means it has a property called results, which, as you can see, contains, in this case, 3 objects, 3 object instances. So if I put d.results, there we go. Now I get the full range of data. So you can see I've got lots of different columns. And if you haven't seen it before, I can now use the new grid designer, which I won't go into a lot of detail with because Sam's going to show that as worked examples with ServiceNow. But I can actually go in here now and hide and remove columns really easily if I say, oh, look, these bunch of GUIDs, I don't really want those showing up, so get rid of those. Or perhaps I want the folder it's in to appear first, so I can drag that to the top of the list and modify all these columns. So great example there of just a simple Windows authenticated app. I can now go and clean this up and very quickly integrate data from a third-party source inside Squared Up. Okay, so that's all very well and good. That's doing it for Orchestrator. Let's do it for something cool and sexy because that's not really Orchestrator these days. So Sam, I'm going to give you control again.
So for ServiceNow, it's a little more complicated than that.
Okay.
First thing we're going to do is check our ServiceNow permissions. We just want to see that everything in here is configured properly. So usually, if you're doing ServiceNow queries, you'll actually be using a custom user just for all of these queries. But for the sake of our development instance, we'll be using the system administrator.
Okay.
And of course, the system administrator definitely has permissions, but just the one to look out for is you'll want the web service admin role. And so if we click edit here, then you can see on the left-hand side here, we would have the web service admin if it wasn't already in. Of course, it's already here. So that's all looking good there.
Okay, so that means that the credentials that we're going to give to Squared Up effectively have the rights inside ServiceNow they need to be able to query all the different ServiceNow data.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then the one other thing that we need to check is that the table that we'll be accessing has the allow web service access role ticked.
Okay.
So we're just going to jump into the change request table just to check that that's there.
So presumably the idea here with ServiceNow is that, like, if you had a sensitive table that you didn't want people to be able to see via Web API requests, you could then restrict that by saying, actually, this should not be shared out.
Yep, exactly. So this is usually enabled by default, but always worth checking before you go and do a request, because if you spend half an hour trying to configure something only to find that the reason it wasn't working was because this was unticked, that's quite a fun one.
That sounds like you're speaking from experience there, Sam.
Oh, yes. So that is all looking quite good.
Okay.
Next thing we need to do is go back into this providers page. And we already have this broken ServiceNow provider, but let's create a new one.
Okay. There's a lot more fields now. So you've changed the provider type over to auth.
Yep.
Okay.
I've given it a name, ServiceNow, and the grant type will be password for this.
Okay.
You might be wondering, how do we know it's password? And so there's some really comprehensive documentation on the ServiceNow platform. It's just worth stressing that if you are setting up some of these OAuth providers, you're going to have to be either familiarized with the documentation or at least speak to the application owner and have them look up this sort of thing for you.
Right, okay.
Here the grant type can either be password or refresh token. Now refresh token is more of an internal one. Password is the one that we want to use right here. And then we can see all of the information that we'll need to pass along with that.
Okay.
So we'll just jump straight back in. We need a base URL here, as we saw on the orchestrator provider. So I'm just going to copy that. That's just our ServiceNow developer instance.
Okay.
And then
so that'll be unique to our customers, right? So each one will have a different URL they'll need to jump to.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And we need a token URL as well.
Okay.
So this will be similar for all ServiceNow users.
Okay.
It's /auth_token.do.
Okay.
And this is, of course, also specified in the documentation.
Right, there we go. So that's how we find it. Okay, cool. So that so the base URL is the one that we use for requests. The token URL is how we're going to authorize this provider. And then the username and password is the username and password for the user that we configured inside ServiceNow.
Yeah, so that's
Okay.
the username and password, in this case for the system administrator, which obviously you would definitely want to use a specific, REST API user with just the permissions that they want, and not the one with total admin privileges.
Okay, so yeah, it's definitely make sure you use the right one there. And
our
then
next step is to add the client ID and client secret,
right,
which we haven't made yet. So let's just jump straight in to ServiceNow again.
Okay.
And in the application registry, we'll be creating a new application, which is an OAuth API endpoint for external clients,
Okay.
because we want our external client squared up to talk to ServiceNow.
Okay, so that name there, you can give it anything, but obviously make it nice and descriptive so you know what this particular app is.
Yep.
Okay.
So most of this is irrelevant for creating an API endpoint for squared up. Really all you need to fill in is the name, and the client ID will fill in itself. And if you leave the client secret blank, it will choose a nice secure one for you.
Okay, that's good.
So we just created that and jumped back into it so that we can copy out this client secret.
Okay. So if you ever lose that or need to recreate it, you can come back into ServiceNow and get those values back if you need to. Or rather, your ServiceNow admin can. So this is something that likely you won't have access to, so you'll probably need to engage your ServiceNow subject matter expert to be able to get access to these.
Yep. And the authorization scope here, in the documentation, it will say if you need to include this. This is usually just to scope your API client to say, it can only access a certain portion of the API. In the case of ServiceNow, it's just not used, so we leave it blank and click Add Provider. And when you see that green tick next to an OAuth provider, that means that it has indeed been authenticated successfully and has an access token.
Okay, so the green tick next to simple providers like the Orchestrator one just means you configured settings, but for OAuth ones, that green tick actually means I'm connected, I'm able to retrieve everything I need to.
So it's done a request to validate that, and we know that we have an access token.
Cool, okay. So I'm just going to jump in now and just show off sort of one quick slide before we get to actually creating some queries. So let me just grab the result back. So when you're using the tile, there's a couple of best practices we really want you to think of. And the first one, and the most important one, and Sam's already kind of mentioned this, is you need to either get hold of the API documentation or a subject matter expert for the API you're going to integrate with. Squared up is actually pretty easy to configure once you've got the connection sorted. After that, it's all about knowing the tables and the queries and the filtering language and everything else of your API. So if you're going to really struggle if you don't know what you're looking for in that API or how to communicate with it or sort of have experience with the configuring permissions on it and everything else. So definitely get hold of the documentation and actually read it. If you're having trouble, test your query with like a tool like PowerShell or curl or Postman and see the results directly to make sure that it's actually like not squared up something the problem, it's maybe your query language. Because as Sam mentioned, he spent ages trying to debug an issue and it turns out actually the account just didn't have permissions properly. So if you can rule out squared up and say, no, actually, I can't even make this query from the developer's docs sample with the command they gave me, something else must be wrong here. Perhaps it's a permissions issue, perhaps it's an accessibility issue. And the other thing is the grid designer makes it really easy to like hide and get rid of columns and data. But if you can filter unnecessary data out using the API, so that the dashboards load faster. Like if you pull in 600 columns and then only display 2 of them, Squared Up is still pulling 600 columns from the API. It's still loading that, storing it into memory and caching it and returning it to your client. So you really don't want to be pulling that data around, potentially for multiple tiles on a dashboard, if you don't need to. That said, if several different tiles on the dashboard, like a couple of different scalars, are going to use the same data, but then just filter it slightly differently or display it slightly differently, it might be worth leaving that query sort of with those extra columns in, just so that we can cache it across multiple different dashboards or across the same tiles on a dashboard. And the final point, and this applies to our SQL tile and also our OMS tile, is that users will need the construct sensitive queries permission in Square authoring to be able to create and edit Web API tiles. And the reason for that is that we are allowing those users now to write queries that run arbitrarily against other systems. So you should only really give this to trusted users who you don't have any concerns about the kind of queries they'd put in there. And so that advice goes for sort of all these other things. They can still they can still see the results of that tile. So if you don't trust your other users, then potentially don't give that right to them and create those tiles for them, and then let them create and edit the rest of the dashboard. It's only that one tile that they won't actually be able to change. So do keep that in mind. Okay, that's enough rabbiting for me. Let's get on to the actual demo. So at this point, it's going to turn over to Sam. So Sam is going to show us how to create a perspective for Windows servers that shows like change and incident information from ServiceNow alongside of our SCOM data. So that's that perspective we've always teased you with in the coffee breaks. You're actually finally gonna actually get to see that now. So
right, so I'm going to jump into one of our web servers here.
Mm-hmm.
And when this loads, I'll create a new perspective.
Okay, so this would work on dashboards as well. So you could create a dashboard that just shows all incidents or all change, but in a large organization, that's probably going to be quite a lot of data that wouldn't necessarily be too meaningful. So scoping that with a perspective is probably a great way to get started with this.
Yeah, so we're just going to leave this scope to the Windows Server class.
Mm-hmm. And if you haven't seen, just while Sam tells the details, if you haven't seen perspectives before, definitely check out our previous coffee breaks on the topic as well, because we go into details of what those settings actually meant there. So sorry, go on.
Yep. Right, so here we'll be creating a Web API grid tile. So what we're going to be pulling down is the list of change requests from ServiceNow
Mm-hmm.
against this server in particular. So first, I'll just type in table change request. And I do believe I can, yep. So this is the REST API Explorer in ServiceNow. So whenever you're creating new tiles against an external service, it's really great if they have something like this where you can sort of, a sandbox to play with queries. For ServiceNow, they have this REST API Explorer, and I can see that the table name that I've chosen, change request, has an internal name of change _ request.
Ah, that's how you get the value.
Yep, that's really nice and easy. Going to leave this as a get request.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can see, we already have a list of results. It's this huge list of objects. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do is add a parameter to limit this to just 10 results.
Okay.
This is, of course, all documented.
Mm-hmm.
ServiceNow has a brilliant, very comprehensive documentation for their table. And so this is the limit parameter. We're also going to add the display value parameter,
Mm-hmm.
which means we'll be pulling back specifically the display values. So instead of just, say, numbers without meaning, we'll be pulling out, say, a number with what that number means.
Right, so if you've got like rich objects where it's like a user isn't just a single name field, it's a whole bunch of properties, rather than getting the ID of that user, giving their actual name as well.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
And for things like priority, it will say, instead of just for, which is pretty arbitrary, it will say for critical.
Right.
And then that's like a little bit more insight into what's happening there.
Mm.
I think we can leave that as it is for now.
Okay.
We'll come back to the data in a moment.
Yep.
I've just typed in result there to get the actual results, and you can see, oh my, there's a lot of data there.
Yeah.
So ServiceNow is, it is the king of data. It just has so much, and whilst we could go through right now and hide at least 60 columns and get down to just those that we really care about, I think what we're actually going to do is jump back into that REST API Explorer
Mm-hmm.
and copy a list of fields that we'd like to have returned.
Okay.
We can still definitely make use of this grid designer, but
So just go back to that screen for a second. Like the list of fields there, is that all the fields or?
So this list of fields is just the ones that we want. So
that's cool.
on the left-hand side, we have available fields, and you can see it as a huge list. I've just picked out a few which seem like a good amount to get a nice idea of what was happening with these change requests.
And that's a really good example as well there of when you're looking at those fields, actually talk to the people who this dashboard's going to. You know, we had a few weeks ago, Sean Williams was saying like he didn't just pick metrics out of the air, or these seem correct. He actually asked the teams, okay, you know, you want to see ServiceNow data, what do you actually want to see, so that it's actually meaningful to everyone, rather than these seem like a good idea and then no one actually needs that information. Okay, so that's limited it down to just those.
Yep,
that's
so
much
we
easier.
have much nicer ones. As you can see, this opened by is still an object, which, you know, that doesn't really make sense. This was opened by a person, not an object. So let's take a look at this. We can edit the column using our new grid designer. And when we click this little mustache button, there we go. We get the display value that we want. So this was opened by the system administrator. That makes a little more sense.
And if you haven't seen this sort of moustache and custom label sort of functionality before, check out our coffee break. I think the second one we did was on custom labeling, and we talk all about how you can format this, because it's not just like bringing out different properties. You could change that to like, if the column was originally last name, first name, you could flip that round or do any other kind of transformation or formatting you need on the value.
Yep. And then just let's reorder this. Let's have the description come before. You know, maybe opened by at the end. And this system ID, whilst it will be useful in just a minute, it's not very useful to have that displayed. That's just sort of meaningless data. Okay. Then we could also, you know, rename these and.
Good. So for those of OCD, we can actually make it all uppercase and.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Right. Let's just leave that as that. I'm sure someone will be complaining.
Oh, you've got one column. No.
Just left by itself. Yeah. Let's, as the next stage, let's have these link out back into ServiceNow.
So this is the big feature, like everyone's been asking for this, right? So like, can I make it so that you can click on a row and hyperlink out to something else?
Yeah, so I'm actually just going to cheat a little and take this sample change request. So all this is just a link to a single change request, which when it loads, this is just a simple change request. What we have here, we can just delete the ID from this part, and then in the same way that we did before, we can add in this parameter. Right,
so you've basically taken that URL for a particular incident, found the unique value that's being passed in, like the ID in this case, and then parameterized it so that in future queries, like each row can then insert the appropriate ID for it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's done. And then just clicking into any of them after a few seconds of loading, we get.
Awesome. Now, at this point, presumably the user would have to have access to ServiceNow, right? This isn't squared up anymore doing this.
Yeah, so if you were signed out of ServiceNow, you'd just had a login page here. But yeah, I think that's a really nice way to get people straight in so that they can start messing around with these.
Yeah, that's really, really awesome.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, we're going a bit long for time, so normally I'd love at this point to like go into some of the other options we have with ServiceNow in terms of like adding extra filter parameters and things. Now, Sam has very kindly agreed actually to record another video with me. So what we're going to do is create a sort of deep dive now into ServiceNow. So we'll go into a lot of the other filter options, some of the other tables, how to bring through other objects, and really build out a full dashboard that sort of shows all that stuff off. So if you're watching this on YouTube, there should be another video, and I'll put a link in the description below when that's up in this one. So go and check that out now. If you're watching this on, live on the webinar, joining us the coffee break, sorry about that, but it'll be up within a day or two as well. So we'll send that notification to everyone to say, hey, this is now up actually for registrants, so you can see that as well and make sure you don't miss out. I hope everyone can sort of see the value of this now. Like, you can now come to a server and you can go to the ServiceNow tab and immediately see in context, these are all the changes, assigned to this machine. So perhaps it was working fine yesterday, now it's broken. Well, something's clearly changed here. Now you can actually integrate that process without having to switch to a different tool, go and find it, make sure you're looking at the right server. And in a key outage sort of scenario, being able to see all that information in one place and making sure that everyone's working from the same set of knowledge can be really, really powerful. So hopefully that sort of inspired you now, seeing that to actually go off and start looking at this. Whether you have ServiceNow or a different CMDB tool or another monitoring tool, you can see the value of pulling in data from other sources and having that all in the same context. And we've just put ServiceNow on the screen here, but you could put SCOM tiles right next to this as well and have that all in the same context. So this is definitely very powerful stuff. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone. If you have an idea for a great topic that you'd love us to cover on these future coffee breaks, please do go to squaredup.com/topics. You can go there and vote for topics that interest you. And also there's a free form field so you can suggest future topics. If you decide, actually, seeing this, I've got a particular API I'd like to see if you could integrate with. Perhaps you could do a coffee break on that. It'd be really interesting. So definitely let us know and give us feedback. We want to make sure that these are as valuable as possible. If you want to see what's coming up next, you can go to the Coffee Break series microsite on squaredup.com. There's a list of the future sessions along with a sign-up link. So if you've seen this and go, actually I need to send this to my ServiceNow guy so he can take a look at this, or he'd be interested in future topics as well, because we're all pulling together as one team, then you can send him there and he can sign up for the webinar. The recordings and slide are published via our blog, along with a whole bunch of other useful content as well. So definitely go and check that out if you haven't been keeping up with that. We publish all sorts of stuff there. And we also have a playlist for this series now, because if you're new to this series, there's a lot of content we've created for these coffee breaks. So definitely go and look back through all of that. We're even internally now using that for new starters and things. We're like, hey, go and check out all these videos. It'll really get you started with Squared Up. So it's definitely worth looking at that. As I said, we'll record another video very shortly for Squared Up integrating with ServiceNow, sort of a deep dive. So this will sort of dovetail in nicely to that. So thank you very much for joining us. Sam, thank you very much for joining me today. And also all the hard work you put into this feature, because personally I use this quite a bit here as part of the solutions team. So it's really great to see this sort of expand and improve. So thanks for that.
Oh, thank you very much.
So guys, if you're on the webinar, as always, our technical team are online and they're free to answer questions, as are myself and Sam. So if you've got any questions and you've seen this and think, actually, hang on a minute, can you just go back to that, or can you cover over a different topic, please let us know via the chat and we'll hope to answer those off. If not, have a great day, everyone, and thanks for joining us.